In 486 AD, the last Roman army in Gaul made its final stand against a young Frankish king named Clovis on a battlefield near Soissons, and our silver-armored good knight stood with the dying eagles as 12,000 warriors clashed in the battle that would end 5 centuries of Roman rule and birth the kingdom that would become France. As Syagrius, the final Roman commander north of the Loire, led his desperate forces against the rising tide of Germanic ambition, this wasn't just another territorial dispute. It was the death of an empire and the birth of medieval Europe itself. Watch as the last vestiges of imperial Rome crumble before Frankish spears, as ancient traditions give way to new realities, and as our immortal knight witnesses the precise moment when the classical world died and the medieval age began. From the famous incident of the vase of Soissons that would define royal authority for generations, to the brutal execution that taught the Franks the true meaning of absolute power, every moment of this epic tale shaped the destiny of Western civilization. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to history's greatest turning points, where our eternal knight in silver armor guides you through the rise and fall of empires with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below how you would survive this age and which pivotal moment in history you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that fateful day in 486 AD when the Roman world ended forever. A Good Knight Story. The Last Roman. Chapter 1. The Weight of Silver. The morning mist clung to the hills north of Soissons like the breath of dying gods, and the good knight felt its dampness seep through the joints of his silver armor. 5 centuries had passed since he first donned this gleaming mail, yet it remained as bright as the day it was forged, untarnished by time, unmarked by the countless battles that had tested its strength. He stood motionless on a low ridge, watching the Roman camp stir to life in the valley below, and wondered if this would be the morning when even silver could not turn aside the tide of history. The year was 486, though such numbers meant little to one who had walked through decades as other men walked through seasons. What mattered was the feeling in the air, that electric tension that preceded the death of empires. He had felt it before, in the last days of Carthage, in the final hours of Jerusalem's Second Temple, in the moments before barbarian hordes swept across the Rhine. It was the scent of endings, sharp and metallic, like blood on a blade. Below him, the domain of Soissons prepared for what its defenders surely knew would be their final stand. This last fragment of Roman authority in Gaul stretched between the Loire and Somme rivers, a stubborn remnant of an empire that had officially died a decade ago when little Romulus Augustulus was deposed in distant Ravenna. Yet here, in these rolling hills and fertile valleys, Roman eagles still flew. Roman discipline still held the line. Roman law still governed the lives of farmers and merchants who remembered when Caesar's legions had first brought civilization to these barbarian lands. The good knight adjusted his grip on his spear and felt the familiar weight of his sword at his hip. Both weapons had tasted the blood of Franks before, in smaller skirmishes along the frontier, but today would be different. Today Clovis himself had come, the young king who had spent 5 years consolidating his power gathering allies, preparing for this moment when he would either establish himself as the master of Gaul or die in the attempt. A horn sounded from the Roman camp, its bronze voice carrying across the morning air with the authority of centuries. The good knight had heard that same call in Britain, in Spain, in Africa, wherever Roman soldiers had stood against the darkness. But now, as he watched the last Roman army in Gaul form its ranks, he wondered if this horn would be the final one to sound in these lands. After today, would there be anyone left to remember the proper calls, the ancient formations, the traditions that had built an empire? The mist began to lift, revealing the full scope of Syagrius's forces. 6,000 men, Gregory of Tours would later write, though the good knight could see that the chronicler's count was generous. Perhaps 5,000 stood ready, a mixture of regular Roman troops, Gallo-Roman militia, and Germanic federati who had remained loyal to their Roman paymasters. They moved with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers, but the good knight could sense something else in their movements, the desperate precision of men who knew they were making their last stand. At their head rode Syagrius himself, the man the Franks mockingly called King of the Romans, a title that would have horrified any true Roman of the old Republic. He was perhaps 40 years old, born into a world where Roman authority was already crumbling, raised to command forces that grew smaller each year. His father, Aegidius, had carved out this domain through military skill and political cunning, maintaining Roman rule through 2 decades of chaos. Now the son bore that burden, and the good knight could see in the set of his shoulders the weight of 5 centuries of Roman history. The good knight had chosen his side not from any love of Rome. He had seen too much of Roman cruelty, Roman arrogance, Roman blindness to the suffering of those they conquered. But there was something in Syagrius's defiance that called to him, something in this last stand that seemed worthy of witness. Perhaps it was simply that he had always been drawn to lost causes, to the final moments when courage mattered more than victory. Or perhaps it was that he recognized in Syagrius something of himself, a man out of time, clinging to an identity that the world no longer wanted. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist, and the good knight could see the Frankish host approaching from the north. They came not as a mob of barbarian raiders, but as an organized army. Clovis had learned much from his Roman enemies. The young king rode at their head, his long hair flowing free in the Germanic fashion, his weapons gleaming with the gold and silver that marked his royal status. Behind him came his allies, Ragnachar from Cambrai, bringing his own warriors, other Frankish kings who had answered Clovis's call for this decisive campaign. But the good knight's experienced eye caught something else, a smaller force hanging back, neither advancing with Clovis nor retreating. Cararic, he realized, another Frankish king who had brought his men to the campaign, but now waited to see which way the battle would turn. It was a prudent strategy, perhaps, but it spoke to the fractured nature of Frankish unity. Clovis might have assembled this army, but he had not yet truly united his people. That would come later, the good knight suspected, after today's work was done. The 2 armies drew closer, and the good knight could feel the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded battle. His silver armor seemed to grow heavier, as if the metal itself understood what was coming. He had fought in more battles than any man should remember, had seen empires rise and fall, had watched the wheel of history turn through its endless cycles of conquest and collapse. Yet each time, the moment before the killing began, still filled him with the same mixture of dread and anticipation. A messenger rode hard from the Roman lines, his horse's hooves drumming against the earth like a funeral march. The good knight watched him approach Syagrius, saw the brief exchange of words, the nod of acknowledgement. The challenge had been issued and accepted. Clovis, in the manner of Germanic kings, had demanded single combat or pitched battle, specifying the time and place. Syagrius, confident in his forces and his cause, had agreed. There would be no retreat, no negotiation, no compromise. Only steel and blood would decide the fate of Roman Gaul. The good knight spurred his horse down the ridge toward the Roman lines. As he rode, he thought of all the battles he had witnessed, all the empires he had seen crumble. Rome had seemed eternal once, its legions invincible, its eagles destined to fly over all the world. But nothing was eternal except change itself. And today that change would be written in the blood of brave men who fought for causes already lost to time. He took his place in the Roman formation, his silver armor gleaming among the bronze and iron of his companions. Around him, veterans of a dozen frontier wars checked their weapons and muttered prayers to gods, both Christian and pagan. These were good men, the good knight knew. Soldiers who had held the line when others fled, who had maintained order when chaos threatened to consume everything. They deserved better than to die for a cause that history had already abandoned. But they would die nonetheless, because that was what soldiers did. They stood where they were ordered to stand, fought when they were ordered to fight, and died when death was required of them. The good knight had learned long ago that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And as he watched the Frankish host deploy for battle, he felt that familiar, cold certainty settle over him like a shroud. The last Roman army in Gaul was about to fight its final battle, and the good knight, in his gleaming silver armor, would stand with them until the end. The sun reached its zenith as the two armies completed their deployments, casting sharp shadows across the battlefield that would soon be soaked with blood. The good knight sat motionless on his war horse, feeling the animal's tension through his legs as it sensed the approaching violence. Around him, the Roman formation stretched in the traditional pattern that had conquered the world. Infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, reserves positioned to exploit any breakthrough or shore up any weakness. But this was not the Rome of Caesar or Trajan. The good knight could see the differences in every detail. The mixture of equipment that spoke of supply shortages, the Germanic auxiliaries whose loyalty was measured in silver rather than oath, the nervous energy of men who knew they fought not for glory, but for survival. These soldiers bore the name of Rome, but they were something new, the last generation of a dying breed, neither fully Roman nor completely barbarian. Syagrius rode along the front ranks, his voice carrying clearly in the still air as he addressed his men. The good knight had heard such speeches before, in a dozen languages and 100 battles. They always said the same things: duty, honor, the righteousness of their cause, the certainty of victory. But there was something different in Syagrius's words, a note of finality that made even the veterans straighten in their saddles. "Men of Rome," Syagrius called, his voice strong despite the weight of his years. "Today we fight not just for territory or treasure, but for the very idea of Rome itself. Behind us lie the cities our fathers built, the roads they paved, the laws they wrote. Before us stand those who would see all of that reduced to ash and memory." The good knight watched the faces of the soldiers as their commander spoke. Some were young men who had never known any authority but Syagrius's, who thought of themselves as Romans because that was what they had been taught. Others were grizzled veterans who remembered when Roman eagles flew from the Rhine to the Atlantic, when the word of Caesar was law from Britain to the Black Sea. All of them, young and old alike, understood that they were about to fight for something that was already dead everywhere else in the world. "The Franks call me King of the Romans," Syagrius continued, and the good knight heard the bitter irony in his voice. "They mock a title I never claimed, for I am no king. I am what I have always been, a servant of Rome, a guardian of her legacy, a keeper of her flame. And today, by God's grace and your courage, that flame will not be extinguished." A cheer rose from the Roman ranks, but it was a hollow sound, like an echo in an empty hall. The good knight had heard the war cries of victorious armies, had felt the earth shake beneath the feet of men who knew they could not lose. This was different. The desperate defiance of men who would fight because fighting was all they had left. Across the field, the Frankish host was completing its own preparations. The good knight studied their formation with the eye of a professional soldier, noting the differences from the Roman deployment. Where the Romans fought in disciplined ranks, the Franks organized themselves around their war leaders, clusters of warriors bound by personal loyalty rather than military hierarchy. It was a more flexible system in some ways, allowing for rapid movement and individual initiative. But it required strong leadership to prevent it from dissolving into chaos. Clovis provided that leadership. Even at a distance, the good knight could see the young king's presence holding his army together. He rode a magnificent stallion, its coat as black as a moonless night, and his weapons caught the sunlight like captured stars. But it was more than his equipment that marked him as a king. It was the way his men looked at him, the confidence in their movements, the certainty that they followed a leader who could not be defeated. The good knight had seen many such leaders in his long life. Some had been great men, others merely lucky, but all had possessed that indefinable quality that made other men willing to die for them. Alexander had possessed it, and Caesar and a dozen barbarian chieftains whose names were now forgotten. Clovis had it too, and that made him more dangerous than any weapon his army carried. A horn sounded from the Frankish lines, not the bronze voice of Roman discipline, but the wild call of Germanic war horns that had echoed across the forests of the north for centuries beyond counting. The sound sent a shiver through the Roman ranks, not of fear, but of recognition. This was the voice of the future, harsh and primal and utterly without mercy. The good knight checked his weapons one final time. His spear was ash wood tipped with iron, its point honed to razor sharpness. His sword was older than memory, its blade bearing patterns that no smith now living could reproduce. His shield bore no device, no mark of allegiance, only the dents and scratches of 100 battles. He was ready for what was to come, as ready as any man could be for the ending of the world. But first there would be the waiting. Always, before battle, there was the waiting. That stretched moment when armies faced each other across a field that would soon be carpeted with the dead. It was a time for final prayers, last thoughts of home, the settling of accounts with whatever gods a man served. The good knight had learned to use these moments well, to center himself in the calm before the storm. He thought of the battles he had fought, the causes he had served, the men he had killed, and the friends he had lost. So many faces, so many names, so many final moments when brave men had looked death in the eye and refused to blink. They were all gone now. Those companions of his youth and middle years returned to the earth that had given them birth. Only he remained, eternal and unchanging, a witness to the endless cycle of rise and fall that marked the passage of human history. A movement in the Frankish lines caught his attention. Clovis was riding forward, alone, his weapons sheathed, but his bearing unmistakably martial. The young king stopped perhaps 50 paces from the Roman front rank and raised his voice in the traditional challenge. "Syagrius!" he called, his words carrying clearly across the field. "You who call yourself the last Roman in Gaul, I offer you single combat, king to king, leader to leader. Let our personal strength decide this matter, rather than the blood of our followers." The good knight felt a stirring of respect for the young Frank. It was an honorable offer in the old tradition, and it would spare many lives if accepted. But he also knew it would not be accepted. Syagrius was no coward, but he was also no fool. Clovis was 20 years younger, trained from childhood in the arts of war, and possessed of that reckless confidence that made young men dangerous in single combat. Syagrius had other strengths: experience, discipline, the loyalty of professional soldiers, but they would not serve him in a duel. "I thank you for the honor of your challenge," Syagrius replied, his voice formal and correct. "But I am no king to meet you in single combat. I am a servant of Rome, and Rome's servants fight with Rome's armies. If you would have this land, you must take it from all of us, not from me alone." Clovis nodded, as if he had expected no other answer. "So be it," he called back. "Let the gods decide between us." He wheeled his horse and rode back to his lines, and the good knight saw him raise his spear high above his head. The gesture was answered by a roar from the Frankish host that seemed to shake the very earth. The waiting was over. The good knight lowered his spear and felt his horse gather itself beneath him. Around him, 5,000 men prepared to die for a cause that history had already forgotten. Across the field, 6,000 Franks prepared to kill them and claim their inheritance. The Battle of Soissons was about to begin, and with it, the final chapter in the long story of Roman Gaul would be written in blood and steel. The first charge came not from the main lines, but from the cavalry on the flanks, as both commanders sought to gain advantage through mobility and shock. The good knight watched the Frankish horsemen thunder forward, their long spears leveled, their war cries echoing across the field like the howls of wolves. They rode with the wild abandon of men who had never known defeat, their horses' hooves drumming against the earth in a rhythm that spoke of conquest and glory. The Roman cavalry met them with the disciplined precision that had once conquered the world. These were not the cataphracts of the Eastern legions or the heavy cavalry of the late Empire, but they were professionals who understood their craft. They struck the Frankish charge at an angle, seeking to deflect rather than absorb its force. And for a moment the two masses of horsemen became a single writhing entity of steel and flesh and screaming animals. The good knight found himself swept into the melee almost before he realized it was beginning. A Frankish warrior, his face painted with blue woad in the ancient manner, thrust a spear at his chest. The good knight turned the blow with his shield and replied with a thrust of his own, feeling the iron point bite deep into leather and flesh. The Frank fell without a sound, his blood spattering the silver armor that had protected the good knight through so many battles. Around him, the cavalry engagement dissolved into a dozen individual combats, each a desperate struggle between men who knew that hesitation meant death. The good knight parried a sword stroke that would have taken his head, feeling the shock of the blow travel up his arm. His attacker was young, perhaps no more than 20, with the lean build of a warrior born to the saddle. The Frank's eyes held no fear, only the bright madness of battle joy that the GoodKnight had seen in the faces of countless young men who believed themselves immortal. The GoodKnight's return stroke opened the young warrior's throat, and he watched the light fade from those fearless eyes as the Frank toppled from his saddle. There was no time for regret or reflection. Another enemy was already pressing forward, this one older and more cautious, his scarred face speaking of many battles survived. The clash of steel on steel rang out across the battlefield like a deadly symphony, punctuated by the screams of wounded horses and the death cries of men. The GoodKnight fought with the mechanical precision of long experience, his movements economical and deadly. He had learned centuries ago that survival in battle came not from heroic gestures, but from the patient application of skill, the careful conservation of strength, the ability to read an opponent's intentions in the set of his shoulders or the angle of his blade. But even as he fought, part of his mind remained detached, observing the larger pattern of the battle. The cavalry engagement was fierce, but indecisive. Neither side could gain a clear advantage, and both were taking heavy casualties. The real decision would come when the infantry lines met, when the disciplined ranks of Roman soldiers faced the wild charge of Frankish warriors. That moment was approaching rapidly. The GoodKnight could see Clovis himself leading the Frankish center forward, his black stallion prancing with eagerness for battle. The young king had discarded his spear for a long sword that gleamed like captured sunlight, and his voice rose above the din of combat as he urged his men forward. "For the Franks!" Clovis shouted, his words carrying clearly despite the chaos around him. "For glory! For the future!" The Frankish infantry responded with a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. They advanced not in the measured step of Roman legions, but in a wild rush that spoke of forests and freedom, of gods older than civilization and loyalties deeper than law. Their weapons were a mixture of spears and swords, axes and sea-axes, each warrior armed according to his means and his preference. They wore no uniform armor, bore no common standard, yet they moved with a unity of purpose that was more dangerous than any discipline. The Roman line braced to receive them. Syagrius had positioned himself in the center of his formation, his presence a rallying point for men who had served under his father and grandfather. The GoodKnight could see the Roman commander's lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply the quiet recitation of orders. His face calm, despite the storm that was about to break upon his forces. The two lines met with a crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The GoodKnight, still engaged with the Frankish cavalry on the flank, felt the shock of that collision through the ground beneath his horse's hooves. It was the sound of worlds ending, of old certainties crumbling before new realities. The Roman center held, initially, their shields locked together in the ancient testudo formation, their spears thrust forward in a hedge of iron that had broken 1,000 barbarian charges. For a moment, it seemed as if discipline and training might triumph over raw courage and superior numbers. But the GoodKnight had seen this pattern before, in other battles, in other ages. The Romans were fighting as their ancestors had fought, using tactics that had conquered Gaul 5 centuries earlier. The Franks, however, were not the same barbarians that Caesar had faced. They had learned from their defeats, adapted their methods, incorporated Roman techniques into their own warrior traditions. Clovis himself demonstrated this evolution. Instead of hurling himself against the Roman shield wall in a futile display of personal courage, he directed his men with the calculated precision of a Roman general. He sent his strongest warriors against specific points in the enemy line, concentrated his attacks where the Roman formation showed signs of weakness, used his superior numbers not as a bludgeon, but as a surgeon's knife. The good knight watched a gap open in the Roman line as a veteran centurion fell with a Frankish spear through his chest. The man had served for 30 years, had fought in a dozen campaigns, had trained his men to perfection. But perfection was not enough when facing an enemy who combined barbarian ferocity with Roman tactical sense. Frankish warriors poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. The Roman formation, so strong when intact, began to fragment as individual units found themselves surrounded and cut off from support. The good knight could see Syagrius desperately trying to restore order, his voice hoarse from shouting commands that fewer and fewer men could hear above the din of battle. The cavalry engagement on the flanks was also turning against the Romans. The good knight found himself pressed back, fighting a series of running battles as the Frankish horsemen gained ground through sheer weight of numbers. His silver armor was dented now, marked with the scratches and gouges of a dozen near misses. His horse was tiring, its breath coming in great gasps, foam flecking its muzzle. A Frankish spear thrust caught him in the shoulder, sliding between the plates of his armor to draw blood. The wound was not deep, but it served as a reminder of his mortality. Even silver armor could not turn aside every blow, and even the good knight could be killed if enough enemies pressed him at once. He fought his way back toward the Roman center, hoping to rally around Syagrius and make a final stand. But as he approached the main battle line, he could see that the situation was hopeless. The Roman formation was collapsing, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a building whose foundations had been undermined. Individual Roman units still fought with desperate courage, forming small squares that bristled with spears and defiance. But they were islands in a sea of Frankish warriors, cut off from each other and from any hope of mutual support. The good knight watched one such group make a final charge, their centurion leading them forward with his sword raised high. They died to a man, but they died as Romans, and there was honor in that even if there was no victory. Syagrius himself was still fighting, surrounded by his personal guard in the center of what had once been the Roman line. The good knight could see the commander's face, streaked with blood and grime, but still determined. Syagrius had accepted his fate, but he would not yield easily to it. The good knight spurred his tired horse forward, cutting through a group of Frankish warriors who were looting the bodies of fallen Romans. His sword took one in the back of the neck, dropping him instantly. Another turned to face him, raising a battle axe that gleamed with fresh blood. The axe blow would have split a lesser man in two, but the good knight's armor held, though the impact nearly knocked him from his saddle. He replied with a thrust that punched through the Frank's leather jerkin and into his heart. The man fell backward, his axe spinning away into the chaos of battle. But for every enemy the good knight killed, two more seemed to take his place. The Frankish victory was becoming a rout, and even individual acts of heroism could not change the tide of battle. The last Roman army in Gaul was dying, and with it died 5 centuries of imperial history. The good knight reached Syagrius just as the Roman commander's guard was overwhelmed. A Frankish warrior, his face split by a savage grin, raised his sword to deliver the killing blow. The good knight's spear took him in the side, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. "My lord," the good knight called to Syagrius, his voice barely audible above the din of battle. "We must withdraw. The day is lost." Syagrius looked at him with eyes that held no surprise. only a deep weariness that spoke of burdens too long carried. "There is nowhere to withdraw to," he replied, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "This is the end of the line." But even as he spoke, the good knight could see that the Roman commander was wrong. A small group of cavalry had broken free from the main battle and was riding hard toward the south. Syagrius could escape if he chose to, could live to fight another day, or at least to die on ground of his own choosing. "Come," the good knight urged, grabbing the reins of Syagrius's horse. "Your death here serves no purpose. Live, and perhaps Rome may yet have a future in these lands." For a moment, Syagrius hesitated, torn between duty and survival. Then a Frankish war cry rose above the battle noise, closer than before, and the decision was made for him. He spurred his horse forward, following the good knight toward the gap in the Frankish lines, where a few Roman cavalry still held the way open. Behind them, the last organized resistance of the Roman army crumbled into individual acts of heroism and desperation. The Battle of Soissons was over, though the killing would continue for hours yet. Clovis had won his victory, and with it had claimed the inheritance of Caesar and Augustus. The age of Rome in Gaul was ending, and the good knight, his silver armor stained with the blood of two armies, rode south with the last Roman commander toward an uncertain future. The pursuit began almost immediately. The good knight could hear the thunder of Frankish hooves behind them as Clovis's cavalry gave chase to the fleeing remnants of Syagrius's army. The young king was too experienced a commander to allow his enemies to escape and regroup. He would hunt them down like wolves pursuing wounded deer, ensuring that no organized resistance could rise again. Syagrius rode beside the good knight in grim silence, his face a mask of controlled despair. The Roman commander had lost more than a battle. He had lost the last vestige of an empire that had once ruled the known world. Behind them, the smoke of burning equipment rose into the afternoon sky, and the screams of wounded men carried on the wind like the cries of dying gods. The small group of survivors, perhaps 30 cavalry and a handful of infantry who had managed to find horses, rode hard toward the south. They were making for Toulouse, the good knight realized, seeking sanctuary with Alaric II and the Visigothic kingdom. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only option left to them. The landscape through which they fled was beautiful in the way that only doomed things could be beautiful. Rolling hills covered with late summer grass, small streams that caught the sunlight like scattered silver, groves of oak and ash that had stood since before the Romans came. It was the Gaul that poets had sung of, the land that had given birth to heroes and saints, philosophers and warriors. Now it was passing into new hands, and the good knight wondered what those hands would make of it. A shout from behind warned him that their pursuers were gaining ground. He turned in his saddle to see a group of Frankish horsemen cresting the hill they had just descended, their spears glinting in the afternoon sun. They rode with the confidence of victors, knowing that their quarry was exhausted and demoralized. "My lord," the good knight called to Syagrius, "we must make a stand. Our horses cannot outrun theirs much longer." Syagrius nodded grimly. He had come to the same conclusion. "There," he said, pointing to a small hill crowned with a grove of ancient oaks. "We can hold them there for a time." The survivors wheeled their mounts and rode for the hill, their horses' flanks heaving with exhaustion. Behind them, the Frankish pursuit grew closer, their war cries echoing across the countryside like the howls of hunting beasts. The good knight could see their faces now, young men drunk on victory, eager to complete their triumph by taking the head of the last Roman commander in Gaul. They reached the hill just ahead of their pursuers and quickly formed a defensive circle among the oak trees. The good knight found himself next to a grizzled Roman veteran whose armor bore the scars of a dozen campaigns. The man's face was calm, almost peaceful, as if he had finally found the death he had been seeking for years. "Been a long road, hasn't it?" the veteran said quietly, checking the edge of his sword. "From the Rhine to here, fighting for something that died before we were born." The good knight nodded, understanding the man's meaning. They were all anachronisms now, relics of a world that no longer existed. The empire they had served was gone, its eagles fallen, its legions scattered. Yet they would fight one more time, not for Rome, but for the idea of Rome, for the memory of what they had once been. The Frankish cavalry reached the base of the hill and began to circle it like wolves around a wounded stag. Their leader, a young warrior with gold torques around his arms, called up to the Romans in accented Latin. "Surrender, and you will be treated with honor," he shouted. "Continue to resist, and you will die like dogs." Syagrius's reply was to draw his sword and raise it high above his head. The blade caught the sunlight and threw it back like a challenge to the gods themselves. "We are Romans," he called back. "We do not surrender." The Frankish leader shrugged, as if he had expected no other answer. He raised his own weapon and spurred his horse up the hill, his men following close behind. The final act of the Battle of Soissons was about to begin. The good knight braced himself as the first Frankish warrior reached their position. The man came at him with a spear thrust that would have skewered a lesser opponent, but the good knight's silver armor turned the point aside. His return stroke opened the Frank's throat, sending him tumbling from his saddle to lie still among the fallen oak leaves. Around him, the last Romans fought with the desperate courage of men who had nothing left to lose. They were outnumbered 3-1, their horses were exhausted, their weapons were notched and dulled from the earlier battle. But they were professionals, veterans of the frontier wars, and they made the Franks pay dearly for every foot of ground. The grizzled veteran beside the good knight took a spear through the chest, but managed to drag his killer down with him, his dagger finding the gap in the Frank's armor. A young Roman officer, barely old enough to shave, held off 2 attackers with nothing but a broken sword and sheer determination before a Frankish axe ended his defiance. One by one, the defenders fell. The good knight found himself fighting back to back with Syagrius as the circle of Romans grew smaller and smaller. The commander's sword work was still precise despite his exhaustion, each stroke calculated to maximum effect. But even skill and courage had their limits, and those limits were rapidly approaching. A Frankish spear thrust caught the good knight in the thigh, sliding between the plates of his armor to draw blood. He stumbled, nearly falling, and only Syagrius's quick intervention saved him from the follow-up blow that would have taken his head. The Roman commander's sword opened the attacker's skull, but the effort left him exposed to another enemy's thrust. The good knight watched in horror as a Frankish blade punched through Syagrius's mail and into his side. The Roman commander gasped, his face going pale, but he did not fall. Instead, he grabbed his attacker's wrist and pulled him close, driving his dagger up under the man's ribs. "My lord!" the good knight called, seeing the blood spreading across Syagrius's tunic. "You are wounded." Not mortally," Syagrius replied through gritted teeth. "But we cannot hold much longer." He was right. Only a handful of Romans still stood, and they were surrounded by a growing circle of Frankish warriors. The good knight could see more enemies approaching from the base of the hill, reinforcements drawn by the sound of battle. Soon they would be completely overwhelmed. But then, unexpectedly, a horn sounded from the valley below. Not a Frankish war horn, but the bronze voice of Roman discipline. The good knight looked down and saw a small group of cavalry riding hard toward the hill. Romans who had escaped the main battle and were now attempting a rescue. The Frankish leader saw them too and cursed in his native tongue. He had expected an easy victory over exhausted fugitives, not a running battle against determined enemies. He called to his men, ordering them to finish the fight quickly before the reinforcements could arrive. The final assault came with desperate fury. The remaining Franks threw themselves at the Roman position with the reckless courage of men who knew they had only moments to achieve victory. The good knight found himself facing 3 enemies at once, his silver armor ringing like a bell as their weapons struck home. He killed one with a thrust that punched through leather and ribs to find the heart beneath. The second fell to a backhand stroke that opened his neck to the spine. But the third managed to get inside his guard, a young Frank with wild eyes and foam on his lips, fighting with the berserker rage that made men dangerous beyond their skill. The Frank's seax, a long fighting knife, scraped along the good knight's ribs, seeking the gap between armor plates. The good knight grabbed the man's wrist and twisted, hearing bones snap, but the Frank continued to fight even with his hand hanging useless. His left hand found a dagger and drove it towards the good knight's throat. The blade stopped inches from its target, turned aside by Syagrius's sword. The Roman commander, blood streaming from his wounded side, had somehow found the strength for one more precise stroke. The Frank collapsed, his life ebbing away among the oak roots that had drunk the blood of warriors for 1,000 years. "The reinforcements!" Syagrius gasped, pointing down the hill with a trembling hand. "We must reach them." The good knight looked and saw that the Roman cavalry had fought their way halfway up the slope, cutting through the Frankish circle like a sword through silk. But they were few, perhaps 12 men, and more Frankish warriors were arriving every moment. It would be a near thing. "Can you ride?" The good knight asked, helping Syagrius toward his horse. "I can die in the saddle as well as on foot," the Roman commander replied with grim humor. "And I prefer to die moving." The surviving Romans, only 5 now, including the good knight and Syagrius, mounted their exhausted horses and prepared for one final charge. It was madness, but it was the kind of madness that had built an empire. They would ride toward their rescuers and trust to fortune and the favor of whatever gods still watched over Rome. Syagrius raised his sword one last time, the blade wavering but still bright in the afternoon sun. "For Rome," he called, his voice carrying despite his wounds. "For the memory of what we were. For Rome," the good knight replied, and spurred his horse down the hill. They rode through the Frankish warriors like ghosts from a forgotten age, their weapons flashing in the dying light. The good knight's spear took one enemy in the chest, lifting him from his saddle and hurling him aside. His sword opened another's skull, painting his silver armor with fresh blood. Beside him, Syagrius fought with the desperate skill of a man who knew he was living his last moments. His blade wove patterns of death in the air, each stroke precise despite his failing strength. A Frankish axe caught him in the shoulder, nearly unseating him, but he managed to reply with a thrust that dropped his attacker. The Roman reinforcements met them halfway down the slope. Their leader, a centurion the GoodKnight recognized from the morning's battle, shouting orders as his men formed a protective wedge around the survivors. For a moment, it seemed as if they might actually escape, might live to fight another day. But the Franks were not finished. More warriors poured up the hill from both sides, threatening to surround the small Roman force completely. The centurion saw the danger and made the hard decision that commanders sometimes had to make. "Ride!" he shouted to Syagrius. "We'll hold them here. Get to Toulouse. Tell Alaric what happened here." Syagrius started to protest, but the GoodKnight grabbed his horse's reins and pulled him away from the developing fight. Behind them, the centurion and his men formed a line across the hillside, their spears leveled, their shields locked. They would die here, the GoodKnight knew, but their sacrifice would buy time for their commander to escape. The last Romans rode south as the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of blood and gold. Behind them, the sounds of battle faded into the distance, replaced by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on the ancient Roman road that led toward Visigothic territory. Syagrius swayed in his saddle, his face gray with blood loss, but he managed to stay mounted. The GoodKnight rode beside him, ready to catch him if he fell, his silver armor now dented and stained with the blood of 2 armies. "It's over," Syagrius said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of their horses' breathing. 500 years of Roman rule in Gaul, and it ends with a handful of survivors fleeing south like bandits. The GoodKnight said nothing. He had seen empires fall before, had watched the wheel of history turn through its endless cycles. Rome had seemed eternal once, its power unshakable, its destiny written in the stars. But nothing was eternal except change itself, and today that change had been written in blood on a battlefield near Soissons. They rode through the gathering darkness, the last remnants of Roman authority in Gaul, carrying with them the memory of eagles that would never fly again in these lands. Behind them, Clovis and his Franks were already beginning the work of building a new kingdom on the ruins of the old. The age of Rome was ending, and the GoodKnight, eternal witness to the rise and fall of empires, rode on through the night toward an uncertain dawn. Remember that the age of Rome is over, and the age of the Franks has begun. The GoodKnight bowed his head in acknowledgement. It was more than he had expected, more than he probably deserved. Clovis was showing him the same pragmatic mercy he would show to Syagrius's other followers, the recognition that former enemies could become future allies if treated with wisdom rather than cruelty. "I will remember," he promised, "and I will tell the story truly, without favor to either side." "That is all any man can ask of history," Clovis replied. Truth, fairly told. As the sun began to set over the Frankish camp, the GoodKnight prepared to take his leave. His armor had been cleaned and polished, his weapons returned, his horse fed and rested. He was free to go, free to ride away from this place where an empire had died and a kingdom had been born. But as he mounted his horse and prepared to ride south, he found himself thinking not of the future, but of the past. He thought of Syagrius riding toward his doom in Toulouse. He thought of the young Roman soldiers who had died on the hill among the oak trees, their blood watering the roots of ancient trees. He thought of the grizzled veteran who had spoken of long roads and lost causes, who had found his death at last in service to something greater than himself. They were all gone now, those last Romans, returned to the earth that had given them birth. Only their memory remained, carried in the mind of a knight in silver armor who had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon an endless shore, The good knight rode south through the gathering darkness, leaving behind the Frankish camp with its celebration of victory and its dreams of future glory. Behind him, Clovis was already planning his next campaign, his next step toward uniting all the Franks under his rule. Ahead lay the uncertain future, where new kingdoms would rise on the ruins of the old, where new stories would be written in blood and steel. But for now, there was only the road, and the memory of brave men who had died for a cause they knew was lost, and the eternal duty of bearing witness to the endless turning of history's wheel. The Battle of Soissons was over, the age of Rome in Gaul had ended. And the good knight, eternal wanderer, rode on through the night toward whatever dawn awaited him. 1 year had passed since the Battle of Soissons, and the good knight found himself once again in the presence of Clovis, though under very different circumstances. The Frankish king had summoned him to witness what he called a review of the army, a grand inspection of the forces that had grown considerably since that decisive victory in northern Gaul. The good knight stood among the assembled warriors in a great field outside the city that had once been Syagrius's capital. Soissons bore the scars of its conquest, but also showed signs of new prosperity under Frankish rule. The Roman buildings still stood, but they now housed Germanic nobles and their retinues. The streets still followed their ancient patterns, but they echoed with the harsh consonants of Frankish speech rather than the measured cadences of Latin. Clovis had changed in the year since their last meeting. The young king who had shown mercy to a defeated enemy now carried himself with the absolute authority of a man who had eliminated all rivals to his power. His hair was longer, bound with more gold, and his weapons were richer than before. But it was his eyes that showed the greatest change. They held the cold calculation of a ruler who had learned that mercy, while sometimes useful, was a luxury that kings could rarely afford. The army spread out before them was impressive by any standard. Thousands of Frankish warriors stood in loose formation, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun, their faces bearing the confidence of men who had tasted victory and found it sweet. But the good knight's experienced eye noted something else. These were not the same men who had fought at Soissons. Many faces were missing, and he suspected he knew why. "Behold the army of the Franks," Clovis announced, his voice carrying clearly across the field. "United under one king, serving one purpose, bound by one loyalty." The warriors cheered, raising their weapons high, but the good knight heard something forced in their enthusiasm. These men were afraid, he realized, not of their enemies, but of their own king. They had seen what happened to those who opposed Clovis's will, and they had learned the lesson well. The king began his inspection, moving slowly through the ranks, examining weapons and equipment with the eye of a professional soldier. He spoke to individual warriors, asking about their families, their service, their loyalty. Most answered with the proper words, the expected phrases of devotion and obedience. But then they came to a familiar face. The young warrior who had destroyed the silver vase stood in the front rank, his armor polished to mirror brightness, his weapons sharp and ready. He had grown in the past year, filled out from boy to man, and his face bore the scars of recent battles. When Clovis approached, he straightened with obvious pride, clearly expecting recognition for his service. "Ah," Clovis said, his voice pleasant and conversational. "I remember you, the warrior who values tradition above all else." The young man's chest swelled with pride. "Yes, my lord. I have served faithfully since Soissons, fought in 3 battles, taken many enemies' heads." "Indeed, And your equipment, is it in good order? The best, my lord. I maintain it myself, as a true warrior should. Clovis nodded approvingly and moved to examine the man's weapons. He lifted the warrior's spear, testing its balance, checking the binding of the iron point to the ash shaft. Then he moved to the axe, the same weapon that had destroyed the silver vase a year before. This axe, Clovis said, turning it over in his hands. It has seen much use, I think. Yes, my lord. It has tasted the blood of your enemies many times. And yet, Clovis continued, his voice still pleasant, I notice that the edge is not properly maintained. See here, he pointed to a small nick in the blade. This could cause the weapon to bind in an enemy's shield, could cost you your life in battle. The young warrior's face flushed with embarrassment. My lord, No excuses, Clovis interrupted, his tone sharpening. A warrior's life depends on his weapons. If you cannot maintain them properly, how can I trust you to maintain your loyalty? Before anyone could react, Clovis had reversed the axe and brought it down on the young warrior's skull with tremendous force. The man dropped instantly, his blood spattering the polished armor of his companions, his body convulsing once before lying still. The silence that followed was absolute. Thousands of warriors stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might draw their king's attention. The good knight felt his own hand move instinctively toward his sword, then stop as he remembered where he was and what he was witnessing. Clovis stood over the corpse, the bloody axe still in his hands, his face calm and composed. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the field, ensuring that every man present would hear his words and understand their meaning. This, he said, gesturing to the dead warrior, is what you did at Soissons to the vase. The good knight felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the calculated nature of this execution. Clovis had waited a full year, had allowed the young man to serve faithfully, to believe himself forgiven and valued. Then, at the moment of his greatest pride and confidence, the king had struck him down, not in anger, but as a deliberate demonstration of royal power. Let this be a lesson to all, Clovis continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. I am your king, chosen by the gods, blessed with victory in battle. My will is law, my word is final. Those who serve me faithfully will be rewarded. Those who defy me will die. He dropped the axe beside the corpse and walked away, leaving the body where it lay as a reminder to all who saw it. The review continued as if nothing had happened, but the good knight could see the change in the warriors' faces. The forced enthusiasm was gone, replaced by genuine fear and absolute obedience. After the inspection was complete and the army dismissed, Clovis approached the good knight with the same pleasant manner he had shown before the execution. It was as if the brutal killing had never happened, as if the blood on his hands was merely an illusion. "What did you think of my army?" he asked conversationally. The good knight chose his words carefully. "Impressive, my lord. Well equipped, well disciplined. They clearly understand the importance of loyalty." Clovis smiled, apparently pleased with the answer. Yes, they do understand. It took some time to teach them, but the lesson has been learned. Unity requires sacrifice. Sometimes the sacrifice of those who cannot adapt to new realities. Like the young warrior. He was brave, skilled, loyal in his own way. But he could not accept that the old ways must sometimes yield to the new. His defiance at Soissons was not about a silver vase, it was about authority, about who truly rules the Franks. The good knight nodded, understanding the brutal logic of kingship. And now they know. Now they know. There is only one king among the Franks, only one will that matters. Those who accept this truth will prosper, those who do not. He gestured toward the corpse, which was already being dragged away by servants. It was a world that would adapt to Frankish rule, just as it had adapted to Roman rule, because adaptation was the price of survival. The sun was beginning to set as the good knight reached a small village that had grown up around a crossroads where the main Roman highway intersected with an older Celtic track. The settlement was typical of its kind. A few dozen houses clustered around a central square, a small church that had probably been built on the site of an older pagan shrine, an inn that catered to travelers on the Great Road. The innkeeper was a Gallo-Roman, his Latin accent marking him as a descendant of the old provincial aristocracy. He welcomed the good knight with the practiced courtesy of a man who had learned to serve many masters, offering food and shelter without asking awkward questions about allegiance or destination. "You travel alone, Sir Knight?" the innkeeper asked, as he served a meal of bread and meat and wine. These are dangerous times for solitary travelers. "I have been traveling alone for longer than you might imagine," the good knight replied. "I find it safer than traveling in company. Fewer complications, fewer divided loyalties." Wise words. I have seen too many groups of travelers torn apart by arguments over direction, over leadership, over the division of spoils. Better to trust only oneself. They ate in comfortable silence, two men who understood the value of discretion in uncertain times. The inn was nearly empty, only a few local farmers drinking ale by the fire, their conversation muted and careful. Even here, far from the centers of power, people were learning to watch their words, to avoid topics that might bring unwelcome attention. "Tell me," the good knight said eventually, "what do the people here think of their new Frankish masters?" The innkeeper glanced around nervously, then leaned closer and lowered his voice. "They think what they must think, Sir Knight. That King Clovis is strong, that his warriors are brave, that his rule brings order to the land. And what do they really think?" A long pause, then a careful answer. "They think that the world has changed, that the old ways are gone forever, that survival requires adaptation. Some mourn the passing of Rome, others welcome the coming of the Franks. Most simply try to keep their heads down and their families fed." It was an honest answer, the good knight thought, and probably a wise one. The common people had little choice in who ruled them. Their concerns were more immediate, more practical. Food, shelter, safety for their children. Politics was a luxury they could not afford. "And you? What do you think?" The innkeeper was quiet for a long moment, staring into his wine cup as if seeking wisdom in its depths. "I think," he said finally, "that I am too old to change and too young to die. I will serve whoever pays me, obey whoever commands me, and hope that my children are wiser than their father." The good knight nodded, understanding the man's position. He had seen countless such men in his long life. Decent people caught between the grinding wheels of history, trying to preserve what they could while adapting to what they must. They were the true heroes of these dark times, not the kings and warriors who fought for glory, but the ordinary men and women who simply endured. Later, As he lay in the inn's small but clean sleeping chamber, the good knight found himself thinking about the nature of heroism, about the different kinds of courage required by different times. The young warrior who had defied Clovis over the silver vase had shown one kind of courage, the reckless bravery of youth, the willingness to die for principle. But the innkeeper showed another kind, the quiet courage of survival, the determination to preserve what could be preserved while accepting what could not be changed. Both were necessary, the good knight reflected. The world needed its heroes and its martyrs, its kings and its rebels, but it also needed its survivors, its adapters, its quiet keepers of memory and tradition. They were the ones who would preserve the best of the old world while building the new, who would ensure that something worthwhile survived the endless cycle of conquest and collapse. Tomorrow he would continue his journey, riding deeper into a world that was changing faster than any man could follow. But tonight, in this small inn at a crossroads between past and future, he was content to rest and remember, to bear witness to the endless human drama of adaptation and survival. The Battle of Soissons was already becoming legend, its details blurred by time and telling, but its meaning remained clear. The old world was dead, the new world was being born, and men like Clovis would shape its future through will and steel and the terrible necessities of power. The good knight closed his eyes and let sleep take him, his silver armor gleaming softly in the moonlight that filtered through the chamber's small window. Tomorrow would bring new roads, new stories, new witnesses to the endless turning of history's wheel. But tonight there was only rest, and the quiet satisfaction of duty done and memory preserved. Years passed like seasons, and the good knight continued his wandering through a world that bore less and less resemblance to the one he had known in his youth. The Roman roads still stretched across the landscape, their stones worn smooth by countless feet, but they now carried Frankish armies rather than Roman legions, Germanic merchants rather than Mediterranean traders. Clovis had fulfilled the promise the good knight had seen in him at Soissons. The young king had united the Franks under his sole rule, eliminating rivals with the same cold efficiency he had shown in executing the warrior who had destroyed the silver vase. Chararic, who had held back from the battle, was captured and killed along with his son. Ragnachar, who had fought loyally at Soissons, was betrayed and executed when his usefulness ended. One by one, the independent Frankish kingdoms fell to Clovis's ambition, their territories absorbed into his growing realm. The king had also embraced Christianity, converting to the Catholic faith in a ceremony that the good knight had witnessed from the shadows of Rheims Cathedral. It had been a calculated decision, as all of Clovis's decisions were, a recognition that the future belonged to the cross rather than the hammer, that the support of the church was worth more than the loyalty of pagan warriors. The conversion had brought immediate benefits. The Gallo-Roman population, long suspicious of their Germanic conquerors, began to see Clovis as a legitimate ruler rather than a barbarian usurper. The bishops, who had maintained much of their authority through the chaos of the imperial collapse, threw their support behind the Frankish king. Even the Byzantine emperor, desperate for allies in the west, had sent envoys bearing gifts and recognition. But the good knight had also seen the costs of that conversion. The old Frankish warriors, raised on tales of Wotan and Thor, struggled to understand a god who preached peace while his followers made war. Some adapted, finding in Christian knighthood a new expression of their warrior values. Others resisted, clinging to the old ways until Clovis's patience ran out, and they joined the growing list of his victims. The kingdom that emerged from these struggles was neither Roman nor barbarian, but something new, a fusion of Germanic energy and Roman organization, of Christian faith and warrior culture. It would endure for centuries, evolving into the Carolingian Empire and eventually into the Kingdom of France. But its foundations had been laid at Soissons, in the blood of the last Roman army in Gaul. The GoodKnight had returned to that battlefield many times over the years, drawn by memories and the weight of witness. The field itself showed no signs of the great events that had unfolded there. Grass grew green over the graves of Romans and Franks alike, and farmers plowed the soil where empires had died and kingdoms had been born. But sometimes, in the early morning mist or the fading light of evening, he could almost see them again. The silver eagles of Rome facing the wolf banners of the Franks. Brave men preparing to die for causes they believed in. The young king who would reshape the world through will and steel and the terrible necessities of power. Syagrius had died as Clovis had promised, quietly and in secret, his death announced as an illness rather than an execution. The last Roman commander in Gaul had passed into history with barely a whisper, his name forgotten by all but a few scholars and chroniclers. It was a poor end for a man who had fought so bravely for a lost cause, but it was the fate of most who stood against the tide of history. The GoodKnight had outlived them all, Clovis and his enemies, the warriors who had fought at Soissons, the merchants and innkeepers and common folk who had adapted to the changing world. He alone remained, eternal and unchanging, a witness to the endless cycle of rise and fall that marked the passage of human history. He had seen the birth of the Merovingian dynasty and its eventual decline, the rise of the Carolingians and their conquest of most of Western Europe. He had watched as Charlemagne was crowned emperor in Rome, attempting to revive the imperial title that had died with Romulus Augustulus. He had witnessed the Viking raids and the Magyar invasions, the Crusades, and the rise of the medieval kingdoms. Through it all, he had remained what he had always been, a keeper of stories, a guardian of memory, a silver-armored figure who appeared at the great turning points of history to bear witness to the deeds of mortal men. He had fought in countless battles, served dozens of causes, watched empires rise and fall like waves upon an endless shore. But of all the battles he had witnessed, of all the stories he had preserved, none had affected him more deeply than the Battle of Soissons. Perhaps it was because he had seen in that conflict the end of something truly ancient, the final collapse of a civilization that had endured for 1,000 years. Or perhaps it was because he had recognized in Clovis something of himself, a man out of time, shaped by forces beyond his control, trying to build something lasting in a world of constant change. The Roman Empire had seemed eternal once, its power unshakable, its destiny written in the stars. But nothing was eternal except change itself, and even the mightiest empires were subject to the inexorable turning of history's wheel. Rome had fallen not through any single catastrophe, but through the accumulation of countless small defeats, countless compromises, countless moments when the old ways proved inadequate to new challenges. The Battle of Soissons had been one such moment, a single day when the future defeated the past, when adaptation triumphed over tradition, when a young barbarian king proved himself more Roman than the Romans. It had been the end of one story and the beginning of another, the final chapter in the long tale of imperial Rome and the opening verse in the epic of medieval Europe. The GoodKnight continued his wandering, carrying with him the memory of that distant battlefield and the men who had died there. He had promised to tell their story truly, without favor to either side, and he had kept that promise through the long centuries that followed. He had spoken of Roman courage and Frankish ambition, of Syagrius's doomed nobility and Clovis's ruthless pragmatism, of the price of empire and the cost of survival. The world had changed beyond recognition since that day in 486, when two armies had faced each other across a field near Soissons. The Roman roads still carried travelers, but they now led to Gothic cathedrals rather than pagan temples, to medieval castles rather than imperial palaces. The Latin language survived, but it had evolved into the Romance tongues that would give voice to new peoples and new dreams. Yet some things remained constant. Men still fought for causes they believed in, still died for ideals that outlived their mortal frames. Kings still rose and fell, empires still crumbled into dust, and through it all, the great wheel of history continued its endless turning. The good knight had learned to find comfort in that continuity, in the knowledge that human nature remained fundamentally unchanged despite the passage of centuries. The faces were different, the weapons had evolved, the causes had new names, but the essential drama remained the same. Courage and cowardice, honor and betrayal, love and hatred, hope and despair. These were the eternal themes that played out on history's stage, performed by an endless succession of mortal actors. He thought often of the young warrior who had destroyed the silver vase, wondering what had driven him to such defiance. Pride, perhaps, or a stubborn adherence to tradition in a world that was changing too fast to follow. The man had died for his principles, struck down by the very weapon he had wielded in defense of the old ways. There was a certain poetic justice in that, though the good knight doubted the warrior had appreciated the irony in his final moments. Clovis, too, had paid a price for his victories. The young king, who had spoken of serving his kingdom rather than his personal preferences, had discovered that the crown came with a weight that crushed the humanity of those who wore it. He had united the Franks through fear rather than love, had built his kingdom on foundations of steel rather than sentiment. It had been effective, but it had also been costly. The price measured not in gold or territory, but in the slow erosion of the soul. The good knight had seen it happen to other rulers, had watched as the necessities of power transformed good men into tyrants, idealists into pragmatists, heroes into cautionary tales. It was the curse of leadership in a fallen world, the burden that came with the authority to shape the destiny of nations. But perhaps that was as it should be. Perhaps the world needed its Clovises as much as its Syagriuses, its ruthless pragmatists as much as its noble dreamers. The Roman Empire had fallen partly because its leaders had forgotten how to adapt, how to change with the times. The Frankish kingdom had risen because its founder understood that survival required constant evolution, constant willingness to abandon the past in service of the future. The silver vase that had sparked such conflict was long since forgotten, its twisted remains lost to time and weather. But the principle it had represented, the tension between tradition and innovation, between the old ways and the new, remained as relevant as ever. Every generation faced the same choice: cling to the familiar and risk extinction, or embrace change and risk losing their identity. The good knight had chosen a different path, one that allowed him to witness both sides of that eternal struggle without being consumed by either. He was the eternal observer, the keeper of stories, the silver-armored figure who appeared at the great turning points of history to bear witness to the deeds of mortal men. It was a lonely existence, but it was also a necessary one. Someone had to remember. Someone had to preserve the stories that might otherwise be lost to time and telling. The chroniclers would write their histories, the poets would compose their epics, but they would inevitably shape the truth to serve their own purposes, their own understanding of events. Only the good knight remained truly neutral, truly objective, not because he lacked opinions or emotions, but because he had learned to see beyond them, to understand that every story had multiple sides, every conflict multiple truths. The Battle of Soissons had been a Roman defeat and a Frankish victory, the end of an empire and the birth of a kingdom, a tragedy and a triumph, depending on one's perspective. All of these things were true, and none of them captured the full complexity of what had actually happened on that distant battlefield. The truth was larger than any single interpretation, more nuanced than any simple narrative. It lived in the details that the chroniclers omitted, in the moments of doubt and fear and unexpected mercy that revealed the humanity of even the greatest heroes and villains. The good knight carried all of these truths with him as he continued his wandering through a world that grew stranger with each passing year. He had seen the rise of new kingdoms and the fall of old ones, had witnessed the birth of new faiths and the death of ancient gods. He had fought alongside Crusaders and Saracens, Vikings and Byzantines, Mongols and Magyars. Always the observer, always the witness, always the keeper of stories that might otherwise be lost. But of all the tales he had preserved, none meant more to him than the story of that day near Soissons, when the last Roman army in Gaul had made its final stand against the rising tide of Frankish ambition. It had been a small battle by the standards of history, involving only a few thousand men and lasting only a few hours. But it had marked the end of an age and the beginning of another, the final chapter in the long story of Roman Gaul and the opening verse in the epic of medieval France. The men who had fought there were long dead, their bones returned to the earth that had given them birth. But their story lived on, carried in the memory of a knight in silver armor who had chosen to bear witness to their courage, their sacrifice, their humanity in the face of forces beyond their control. The good knight rode on through the gathering dusk, his armor gleaming softly in the fading light, his horse's hooves beating a steady rhythm on the ancient stones of the Roman road. Behind him lay the battlefield, where empires had died and kingdoms had been born. Ahead lay the uncertain future, where new stories waited to be witnessed, new truths waited to be preserved. The wheel of history continued its endless turning, and the good knight, eternal wanderer, rode on to meet whatever dawn awaited him. The Battle of Soissons was over, but the story it had begun would continue for centuries yet to come, shaping the destiny of nations and the dreams of men who had not yet been born. In the end, that was all any of them could hope for: to be remembered, to have their stories told, to know that their brief moment on history's stage had mattered to someone, somewhere in the endless procession of days and years and centuries that stretched from the beginning of time to its ultimate end. The good knight would remember them all, Roman and Frank, victor and vanquished, hero and coward alike. He would carry their stories with him through whatever battles lay ahead, whatever empires rose and fell, whatever new chapters were written in the endless book of human history. For that was his burden and his privilege, his curse and his blessing, to be the eternal witness, the keeper of memory, the silver-armored guardian of stories that might otherwise be lost to the darkness of forgotten time. The road stretched ahead, straight and true in the Roman fashion, leading toward horizons that promised new adventures, new conflicts, new opportunities to bear witness to the endless drama of human ambition and human folly. The good knight spurred his horse forward, ready to meet whatever fate awaited him, secure in the knowledge that he had done his duty, had kept his promise, had preserved the memory of brave men who had died for causes they believed in. The Battle of Soissons was ended, but its echoes would resonate through the centuries, shaping the world that rose from the ashes of the old. And the good knight, eternal wanderer, would be there to witness it all, to remember it all, to ensure that none of it was lost to the hungry darkness of time. The last Roman army in Gaul was gone, but its story would live forever in the memory of one who had chosen to bear witness to its final hour. That was enough. That was everything. The road called, and the good knight answered, riding on through the night toward whatever dawn awaited him in the endless turning of history's wheel. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.